Today, we're going to be looking at social influence. You know what I'm really curious about is, how do we be more persuasive? Or at least recognize when others are trying to persuade us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the lecture actually gets into this in detail by talking about what's called the dual process model of persuasion, which basically says there are two routes to persuasion, the peripheral route and the central route. So the peripheral route is all about quick judgments and emotional responses. It's like the fast track to influencing someone. And it relies on things like catchy slogans, celebrity endorsements, or even just like making people feel good.
So like those commercials with celebrities dancing and smiling?
Exactly. They're not really giving you any logical reasons to buy the product, but they're creating this positive association, making you feel good about the brand.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about the central route then? How is that different?
So the central route is all about logic and reason. It's more of a slow and steady approach to persuasion that relies on like strong arguments and evidence to really convince someone.
So it's less about flashy visuals
Yeah.
and more about the actual substance of the message.
Exactly. And the lecture really emphasizes how important it is to understand these different routes, both for persuading others and also for being aware of when someone is trying to persuade you. That's where something called counter-arguing comes in.
Counter-argue.
Yeah, basically it means like mentally challenging the message that you're receiving, especially if it's something that you care about. So like when you see an ad, don't just passively absorb it. Ask yourself, is this appealing to my logic? Or is it just trying to hook me emotionally?
Have that internal dialogue. Question the message. Make sure it aligns with your values.
Don't just let those persuasive messages wash over you. Be an active participant in the process.
Okay, I like that. Be an active participant. Now, speaking of being an active participant, let's talk about conformity. Have you ever felt pressure to go along with the crowd, even when you weren't really sure if it was the right thing to do?
Oh yeah, all the time. Especially I think when it comes to things like food or music. Everyone's raving about this new restaurant. And you're like, I thought it was just okay. But you don't want to be the only one who doesn't like it.
Exactly.
It's like that fear of missing out.
Yeah, totally. And the lecture actually highlights a classic study on this.
The Ash conformity experiment, they wanted to see if the participant would conform to the group's wrong answer, even though the right answer was obvious. The crazy thing is, even though the answer was obvious, the participants conformed to the group's wrong answer. About a third of the time.
A third of the time, that's a lot.
It is. It's pretty surprising.
It really shows you how powerful that urge is to want to fit in.
Exactly.
So is that like informational influence or normative influence?
It could be a bit of both. Sometimes we genuinely question ourselves in those situations. We think maybe the group knows something that I don't. But other times it's purely about like avoiding social discomfort. We don't want to stand out. We don't want to risk being ridiculed.
Okay, so we've talked about conformity, but what about compliance? Like, how do you get someone to actually say yes to something?
The lecture gets into this by talking about the work of Robert Cialdini. He spent years observing salespeople, marketers, even groups like the Hare Krishnas, to understand how they persuade people. He identified 6 key principles that are still widely used today.
Hit me with some of those principles.
Okay, let's start with reciprocity. Giving out flowers at airports before asking for donations?
Oh, yeah. I always wondered about that.
That's reciprocity in action. They're giving you something small, like a flower, to trigger a sense of obligation, so you feel like you should give something back in return. Another powerful principle is scarcity. Have you ever noticed how limited time offers or exclusive deals make you want to buy something right away? Scarcity taps into our fear of missing out. We're wired to value things that are rare or hard to get. And marketers know this. They use it to create a sense of urgency, push you to make those impulse decisions.
Okay, what about that principle similarity?
Yes, the power of shared experiences. This is why car salespeople will often try to find common ground with potential customers. If they can establish that connection, even if it's just like a shared hometown or a hobby, they're more likely to win your trust and ultimately your business.
Yeah, it's like building that rapport.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got reciprocity, scarcity, similarity.
There's also the foot in the door technique, which is all about starting with a small request and then gradually escalating to bigger ones.
So like asking someone to sign a petition and then later asking them to volunteer their time.
Exactly. Once someone agrees to that initial small request, they're much more likely to comply with larger requests later on.
Sneaky but clever.
And then there's the opposite approach, the door in the feast technique, which involves starting with a large, almost outrageous request, that you know will be rejected.
Wait, why would you do that?
Because after that big request is rejected, you hit them with a smaller, more reasonable request. That now seems much more appealing by comparison.
So, wow, these techniques are fascinating, but also scary when you realize how they're being used on us all the time.
That's why it's so important to be aware of them and to understand the psychology behind them.
Okay, I think it's time to talk about the big one now. Obedience.
All right, this is where things get a little bit dark. We're going to be talking about the Milgram experiment.
Which is probably one of the most famous and controversial psychology experiments of all time.
Definitely, and for good reason. It raises some really disturbing questions about how far people will go when they're given orders by an authority figure.
And the really crazy thing is, the participants in the Milgram experiment, they were just ordinary people.
It's like they were deliberately trying to override the participants' own sense of right and wrong.
2/3. I know that's what I've always heard about the experiment, but it's still hard to believe that so many people would be willing to do that.
It is a really disturbing finding, but it also highlights the incredible power of situational influence. When we're isolated and confronted with an authority figure, our own moral compass can become surprisingly flexible.
It's like all of a sudden your own values and beliefs kind of go out the window.
Exactly. And the lecture talks about how important it is to have allies in those situations, people who are willing to dissent, to stand up and say, no, this is wrong.
So you're not just like blindly following orders.
Strengthen numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this whole idea of group influence, it also plays a huge role in how we behave in groups, right?
And the lecture actually dives into another fascinating experiment to illustrate this point. The Robbers Cave experiment. Basically, they took a group of boys who were complete strangers to a summer camp and divided them into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers.
So they were like artificially creating these group divisions.
Exactly. At first, the boys were just like getting to know each other, forming bonds within their own groups. But then the researchers introduced competition between the groups.
Competition for what?
Oh, like prizes, privileges, bragging rights. They pitted them against each other in games and challenges.
So they were like deliberately trying to stir up some trouble.
Yeah, kinda. And it didn't take long for that rivalry to escalate into full-blown hostility.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. There was name-calling, taunting. They even raided each other's cabins.
That escalated quickly.
It did, and this experiment highlights something called realistic group conflict theory, which basically says that competition for limited resources can lead to conflict between groups.
It's like that old saying, 2 dogs, 1 bone.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's pretty depressing. But is there any way to undo that damage? Once those group divisions are formed, can you bring the groups back together?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what the researchers wanted to find out. So they introduced what are called superordinate goals, which are basically challenges that require both groups to cooperate in order to succeed.
So like a common enemy that forces them to work together.
Exactly. And it worked. These cooperative tasks forced the boys to put aside their differences and focus on the bigger picture. They started interacting more peacefully and were more willing to help each other out.
So it's like finding that common ground.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's good news, right?
Sure.
It means that even when there's conflict between groups, there's still hope for reconciliation.
There is, but here's the thing. Even after the Eagles and the Rattlers worked together and achieved these shared goals, there were still some lingering traces of group bias.
Really?
Yeah, it seems like those group identities, once they're formed, can be pretty hard to completely erase.
So even though they were cooperating, they still saw themselves as Eagles and Rattlers to some extent.
It seems that way.
Wow, that's both hopeful and concerning at the same time.
It is, and it raises some really important questions about how we navigate a world where group divisions and social influence are so pervasive.
Yeah, it really makes you think. Like about all these invisible forces that are shaping our perceptions and behaviors. So after going through all of these different studies and theories about social influence, what's the big takeaway for us? What can we actually do with this knowledge?
I think the biggest takeaway is that social influence is powerful.
We actually need to understand how it works.
Exactly, and we need to be able to recognize it when it's happening to us.
So we can make more informed choices about how we respond.
Right, and this is especially important in today's world, where we're just bombarded with persuasive messages from every direction. You know, advertising, social media, political campaigns, even just our everyday conversations. It's all just a constant stream of influence.
It's like becoming a social influence detective.
Exactly.